Hey there, and welcome back to the cutting room floor. This is where I revisit something from a recent message here at Sunny Slope and take you a little deeper into something. And I'm excited to be back after a little bit of a break over the summer. And we're going to be starting up here a series on First Corinthians here at Sunny Slope over the next few months, actually. And I'm really looking forward to going through this book with you. But I wanted to I thought it would be interesting to dig into some of the background of the letter to First Corinthians and just give you some of the historical behind the scenes stuff that is kind of shapes the meaning of First Corinthians. It turns out that we have two letters from to the Corinthians in the New Testament, but it seems that there were at least four letters that Paul had written. And each of those four letters was prompted by a certain occasion or a problem in the church. And I thought what I would do is just kind of take you through the timeline and some of the history behind how we got to the letter of First Corinthians and a little bit on Second Corinthians as well, and then those two other letters that Paul had written. So a little bit of background for you, just to give you some more information on what was behind Paul's letter to the Corinthians. To do that, let me bring my screen up here. And what you are looking at is a map of Paul's second missionary journey. This is recorded for us in the book of Acts. In particular, we read in Acts chapter 18. This is where we actually read the account of Paul's visit to Corinth. Over here is the city of Athens. And then Corinth is right next door, right there. So here's Corinth. Acts chapter 17, Paul was in the city of Athens. And in Acts chapter 18, Paul moves into the city of Corinth. Now, one of the things that's interesting is when Paul gets to Corinth, he meets up with a couple named Priscilla and Aquila. We don't know a lot about them, but it seems that they were already believers, or at least they were heavily influenced. They were Jewish from the dispersion. Emperor Claudius threatened persecution against all the Christians in Jerusalem, and what that meant is a little bit like blowing on a dandelion, where all of a sudden then you get people. It's like, the dandelion fluff kind of goes everywhere. That's what happened. You had this massive persecution in Jerusalem, and all the Jewish converts to Christianity are forced to scatter across the Roman Empire, and they end up in places like Corinth. And so when Paul travels there on his second missionary journey, already there were people who were at least, if they weren't Christian converts, at least they were familiar with Christianity. And so Paul, in Acts chapter 18, Paul spends some time in Corinth. In fact, we're told that he spends about a year and a half. And during that time, he's working with Priscilla and Aquila. He's working as a tent maker. And he's got a shop in Corinth. In fact, I'll show you something just for fun. I'll show you a couple pictures of downtown Corinth. This is what Corinth looks like. This is likely, it's obviously what it looks like today. This is kind of where Paul would have had his little tent making shop. Gives you kind of a sense of what it might have looked like. At least you can imagine what it might have looked like back in the day. After some time, after some time there in Corinth, about a year and a half, the Jewish people in Corinth have had enough of Paul. They actually turn against him. They arrest him. They put him on trial. And you can see this is actually the location. It's like the town square in Corinth. And this is where Paul's trial would have been. Paul would have been on this, it's called a bema. It's a raised platform, and it's where justice was done in that time. Paul is the Roman governor there, the proconsul, was a man named Gallio. Gallio looked at this and said, this is not a matter for the government, for the Roman government. This is a religious matter. And so Gallio refuses to get involved, but the Jewish people get all upset and they end up beating the ruler of the synagogue, and it turns into quite a violent episode. Why that's important? Well, lots of reasons. One of the reasons why that's important is that it helps us date First Corinthians. We know when Gallio was the proconsul, and we know that's about the year 51. So we know Paul visits Corinth, and he sets up shop in about the year 50, and then about a year and a half later, 51, late 51. That helps us put a rough date on it. After this, so Paul stays there 18 months. After that time, we read only after that trial, we read that he still stays in Corinth for some time. Now, we're not told. That's Acts chapter 18, verse 18. We don't know exactly how long that is. There's a variety of guesses on that. But after that time, then Paul leaves Corinth and he makes his way back to Ephesus. You can see again on my map here. I don't need to draw it. Athens, here's Corinth, and Paul makes his way back to Ephesus. And during this time in Ephesus, Paul actually remains there for some time. He's in Ephesus for a fairly long time. During that time in Ephesus, Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians. He's following up. He's planted this church. He's got a group of believers there, and he communicates with the believers there. He writes a letter. And we know that because in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, Paul actually, he references that. So 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, Paul says, I have written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Now, setting aside the content of that, that simply lets us know that the letter we call 1 Corinthians is not, in fact, the first letter to the Corinthians, because Paul referenced this other letter that the Corinthians had misunderstood, and then Paul is going to correct that. So that letter is lost to us. That letter would have been 1 Corinthians, but we don't have it. So we can only imagine and infer what was in it. But that was the first letter to the Corinthians, written from Ephesus shortly after Paul left the city of Corinth. After he's in Ephesus for a while, you can see he makes his way back finally to Caesarea, and that's where he concludes his second missionary journey. Now, by the year 53 AD, so now we're a couple of years after that, after that second missionary journey, we're back. Paul is back on the road again, right? To borrow that line from Willie Nelson, he's on the road again. Starts out in Antioch and makes his way here through Macedonia, Ephesus, and he's in at this time in Ephesus. Once again, he remains there for about 2.5 years. He's in Ephesus for quite some time. This was sort of a secondary home base for Paul, and it seems that he had a good, strong, must have had connections there and a church there and a community that was very supportive. We know that from later on in Acts chapter 19, 20, and a little bit further. We know that Paul had very dear friends there in Ephesus. He's there for 2.5 years. While he's there, Paul receives a letter from the Corinthians, and this letter contains a number of questions and comments. And as well, there's a letter. There's probably another letter that so a letter from the Corinthians, but also probably a letter from the household of Chloe. We know that from 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul gets this letter that lets him know about some of the problems in the Corinthian church. And so he gets these two communications. One, it seems, from the church as a whole with some questions that are looking for some clarity from Paul, and then possibly another letter or a separate letter from Chloe and the household of Chloe that alerts him to some of these concerns. And so what Paul does is he compiles a response. He writes a letter to the Corinthians that answers their questions, but also addresses the problems that he has become aware of in the church from this correspondence from a family from the family of Chloe. And so Paul then takes that letter and he sends it with Timothy, and he sends Timothy to be the one to deliver the letter. So Timothy brings the letter to the Corinthians. This is the second letter that Paul writes to the Corinthians, but it's the first letter that we have. So that's what we call 1 Corinthians is in fact the second letter to the Corinthians. And this is the letter that Paul writes in response to the questions and concerns that he has been made aware of. And he sends Timothy to deliver that letter. and to make him and to make the Corinthians aware of his response. Now, when Timothy gets to Corinth, it turns out that things have gotten much, much worse. Things are in much worse shape than Paul or Timothy realized. And so it seems that Paul and Timothy connect, and there's some ambiguity on exactly how that happens. The details aren't important, but we do know that Paul makes a visit then to the Corinthians, and this was probably a brief visit, but nevertheless, Paul stops in and visits the Corinthians. Paul refers to this as his painful visit. This was a very difficult visit for Paul to make. He had to go and rebuke the Corinthians and set them straight on a number of serious, not so much doctrinal, but ethical problems that the Corinthians were engaged in. And so this was not an easy visit. This was painful for Paul. Paul was meeting a lot of opposition there in Corinth, and a lot of adversity and a lot of difficulty. After this visit, Paul returns to Ephesus, and he writes. We know from 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that actually Paul writes a letter then to the Corinthians. This is now the third letter that Paul writes, and Paul refers to it as a severe letter. This was a letter in which Paul essentially follows up from that visit. That visit was not a very productive visit. The Corinthians didn't respond well to Paul, and so when Paul leaves, he did not leave on good terms, and he then responded with a letter that was called the severe letter that Paul had written to them. And so you can kind of see how the relationship between Paul and the Corinthians, in one sense, had really deteriorated. Things are not going well. However, Paul receives word later on from Titus. Word gets back to him sometime later that things have actually improved in Corinth. In other words, the Corinthians have responded very favorably to Paul's admonition. Most likely to the letter that he had written them. And so they had done what Paul had instructed. They had expelled the people who were practicing immorality. And as difficult as that must have been for the church, they followed through on that. And the result was that the church was now in a much healthier place. And then Paul writes, and he responds to this with his fourth letter to the Corinthians. So now we're up to the first letter we have is, we don't have it. Paul references it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. The second letter we do have, that's 1 Corinthians. The third letter is that letter of that letter of the severe letter, the letter of tears that Paul writes. We don't have that letter. The fourth letter then is Paul's follow-up, where he writes, and the tone of the letter, by and large, is much better. Paul is pleased with how the Corinthians are doing, and so he writes then what we have as 2 Corinthians. So you can see in all of this a little bit of the story behind 1 Corinthians. No letter, of course, in the New Testament is written in a vacuum. There's historical context, there's historical background, and that just gives you a little bit of insight into the reasons why Paul wrote 1 and 2 Corinthians, as well as that's what we would call them, but as well as 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Corinthians. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you around.